We've spent the last few videos looking at landmark work in cognitive neuroscience largely, in which perception was understood from an internalist point of view as a representation of an external world. And we want to contrast that now with relational approaches, the most famous of which is known as ecological psychology. And the basic thrust here is given in this quotation: ask not what's in your head, but what your head is inside of. It turns out that if you pay attention to the lawful relations that obtain between an organism and its environment, a lot of things become clear that you might otherwise have thought would require computation or cognition in an interiority. Now, this is not entirely new to us. We met this before. We met the box jellyfish larva, and we described it as having the simplest visual system. Now, when we introduced this, we focused on the structure of the larva itself, but it's worth reminding ourselves that this larva exists in an environment, and the environment has a specific structure, and that all the best CDA in the world would be of no use if the gradient of the incoming light to which this larva is steering were not useful for the purposes of the organism. So here too, perception is relational, and it's not separated from action. So within relational approaches to perception, we're dealing with the relationship between an organism and its environment, and this is a mutual relationship. I'll remind you again of the centrality of the role of touch. That is, when you wish to probe the world to find out if something is hard or soft, you have to act on it, and giving the sponge the chance to act back. So this is a reciprocal relationship. And the kind of phenomena that are talked about here don't easily reduce to a description in terms of terribly abstract things, or terribly small things, or terribly big things. Ecological phenomena, in the sense meant within ecological psychology, are to be found at the size of the body. The body provides the scale by which the world is interpreted. Now, this approach has its origins in the work of James J. Gibson. He was a visual psychologist working during the Second World War and afterwards. And from that grew the much broader field of ecological psychology. This is quite different from cognitive psychology. Gibson's work was centered in visual perception. And what he did was, taking a relational stance, he looked at the lawfulness of that relation between the activity of the organism, understood as being goal-directed, and the properties of the environment as they are relevant to that goal. Now, goal appeared there twice. So in an ecological psychology account, any phenomenon will be understood first and foremost as a goal-directed activity, as purposive activity. Now, Gibson's early work was very, very applied. He was not originally a theoretician. He was tasked with the job of figuring out what visual information was needed for pilots to land planes in bad weather. So this was the paradigmatic case that he used. And in studying this, he found little help by asking what's inside the pilot's head, but he looked at the relationship between the pilot in a cockpit and the surfaces surrounding as the plane flies. So in this illustration here, what's shown is something called optic flow. Now, I've shown it out here in the world, but actually this is the pattern of expansion or change that you would find if you examined the retina of the pilot as they're flying this plane. So as the plane flies directly into the wall of a cliff, for example, imagine what's happening on the back of the retina. Similar to what happens when I do this. It zooms, it expands. There's a central point, which is the point of heading. Look at my nose. And look how everything around it is expanding, getting bigger. That pattern is available on the retina. And that is information about an approaching surface. Very important information about an approaching surface. And the pattern of change on the retina as the pilot looks down is quite different. Shown also in the picture is a pattern of what we call shear. This is a lateral translation, so that if we were to look at the retina of the pilot as they're flying, if the pilot looks at the upcoming cliff face, we'll see an expanding pattern. If the pilot looks down at the ground, we'll see a translational pattern. In this respect, the relation between the pilot and the surfaces is intrinsically meaningful. So you can check this for yourself. As you walk towards something, it looms, it gets bigger in your visual field, like this. Notice that happens. That pattern of expansion is the same whether I walk towards the wall or whether I stay still and the wall moves towards me. So the change is not actually informative about the origin of the movement on this analysis, and that disambiguation is still necessary, but the change is meaningful, not about me or about the wall, but about the relationship between me and the wall. And we can take this simple view of a completely different way to look at the eyes and vision, and look at a landmark study by Lee and Reddish from 1981, in which they studied diving gannets. Now, gannets, very big birds found off the southwest of Ireland around Skellig-Michael. They're about 6 feet wingspan, really big birds, and they dive from a great height into the water to catch their fish, sometimes plummeting down quite deep. Now, if you're a big bird with a 6-foot wingspan and you're diving from a height, I know you're not, but if you were, there are 2 things you should know. One is that during the dive, you need to keep your wings out or you will become unstable. And the second thing you need to know is when you hit the water, you need to have your wings in. Otherwise, they'll be ripped off because you're going so fast. So how does the gannet know during the dive when to pull the wings in? Well, we're not going to answer that question, but we're going to look at the relationship between the gannet and the upcoming surface of the water, and note that on the retina of the gannet, there is a pattern of expansion, and a little analysis of this pattern of expansion reveals it to be describable in units, and those units are the units of time. The rate of expansion is proportional to the time to contact. This means that if the gannet has only a simple thresholding mechanism, it can arrange to pull its wings in when the time to contact passes that threshold. And with this, the behavior is sensible. The gannet survives the dive and the entry into the water. And the explanatory load that we might place on the brain of the gannet is hugely reduced by careful analysis of the manner in which this gannet is embedded in its environment, by looking at the relational nature of the pattern on the retina, which arises from a relation between gannet and water, we see that there's an awful lot of relevance just there for the picking up. So that's an important study. Another concept that comes out of ecological psychology, introduced under this name by James Gibson, it's a slightly older concept, is the notion of an affordance. An affordance is a relational property, again, which describes the fit between what an animal or an organism can do and the things in its surrounds that might enable that. So this is asking, what is it about my embedding in an environment that makes it possible for me to do something? You see, Gibson recognized that the change, for example, on the retina, arises from both. The world contributes and I contribute. So for Gibson, to perceive the world is to co-perceive oneself. You don't perceive the world from nowhere. You perceive it from an embodied center, and everything that's laid out around you is meaningful with respect to that embodied center. So when we perceive something, we perceive it as it relates to us and not as it is. The notion of an affordance can be easily illustrated with a cup. The cup does not have an affordance, but for me, I'm a human and I like drinking tea and I have hands. This cup is graspable, which is wonderful. It makes no sense to say that the cup itself is graspable. This graspability lies in the relationship between my hand and the cup. It's graspable if the cup has a certain form and if my hand has a certain form, and that becomes an affordance if grasping the cup becomes something I might contemplate. Consider this diagram. There's a rock on the bottom left, and there are three actors here. There's a cat and a mouse and a person. It would make no sense to talk about the affordance of the rock unless we say for whom it is an affordance. So for the mouse, this rock provides a place to hide, or perhaps something it could climb on. From the cat's point of view, the rock is obscuring the mouse. It's hiding its prey. The human looks at the rock and sees it in terms of what the human can do with it, to throw it, to use it as a tool, or to hurt its toe as a potential danger. Recall several videos ago, I said there's no such thing as an innocent eye. An innocent eye would be a camera in the business of sending images to the brain, a picture we have ruled out that does not relate to what vision is. The notion of an affordance tells us what it is not to have an innocent eye. You interpret the world in terms that are meaningful to you and that are related to what you can do, what you might aspire to doing, to your purposes. The world is, in other words, intrinsically meaningful. Ecological psychology reveals some facts about our perception and action. The representationalist view gives us an awful lot of other things to think about. They don't unify into a single program. We're asking, when we approach the notion of perception, we're sort of asking too many questions all at once, which is why there are so many videos in this series. And there won't be a single story to be told. What we need to find out is which frameworks give us the most secure grasp of which phenomena.